let's start our second panel. It's very nice to be asked to define abnormality. So let's hope we'll contribute to that. I would say that unlike the first panel, which was much more devoted to the real science, to the theory and its finding, a way through the socialist dictatorship, this is more about what the theory and practice of sciences actually did to people, did to certain social groups and certain social situations. That's a fascinating subject, of course, and we've got 3 really interesting papers here. The first speaker will be Christiane Brenner, who is home to Collegium Carolinum for the Czech historiography. She's very well known for her analysis of Czech discourses in early post-war Czechoslovakia, the Czech political discourses of 1945 to 1948. But recently she focused much more on the history of sexuality, fertility, and most recently to prostitution. So we're very keen to hear what she found out in the last 2 years, as far as I know.
So the paper I'm going to present is part, as I already said, is part of my current research on prostitution in socialist Czechoslovakia. This project belongs into a larger context, the collaborative research center Cultures of Vigilance at Munich University. Roughly speaking, the aim of this multidisciplinary work group is to explore how vigilance, organized by the state, as well as the vigilance of groups and individuals, is used to realize common goals. This question also shapes my research, my work. My aim is not to write the history of prostitution in Czechoslovakia between the communist takeover in 1948 and 1989. I try to find out rather how the state handled, this is, defined, controlled, policed, punished, or therapized this phenomenon, which officially wouldn't exist in socialism. Of course, science belongs into this picture of surveillance and governing. In recent years, notable work has been notable research on the expertization of politics in Czechoslovakia since the late 1950s has been done. And there's an ongoing debate on the shift from early socialist utopianism to the planned realization of socialism with scientific help during the 1960s, and then again, the transformation of this idea during normalization. My paper is a contribution to this discussion and also an experiment. First, I'm going to map a scientific field, the network of scientists working on prostitution in Czechoslovakia between the early 60s and the mid-70s. Second, I will focus on one research project. This was a project conducted by Prague sexologists. And third, I try to provide a small insight in how their expertise was put into practice by looking at expert statements in court proceedings with women accused of making their living with paid sex. So first, some remarks on prostitution. I have already indicated that prostitution was not supposed to exist under socialism. According to Marxist-Leninist theory, prostitution was considered a typical outcome of capitalism and bourgeois gender inequality. It was therefore expected to disappear in the process of building socialism. That this did not happen was an open secret. In socialist Czechoslovakia, real existing prostitution amounted to a violation of socialist expectations and socialist norms in 2 respects. It was a transgression against the general obligation to work productively, as well as against long-standing sexual morals. This second aspect was rarely addressed. Prostitution was not exactly a taboo, but usually handled together or rather under other topics, mostly bad work ethics. This fact was also referred in criminal law. Czechoslovakia did not have a special law on prostitution. Instead, prostitution was covered by the so-called paragraph 203 of the Criminal Code on parasitism, which criminalized various unethical forms of money-making or making a living, such as gambling, begging, or living at the expense of others. A person sentenced, according to paragraph 203, could be sent to prison for up to 2 years. First offenders often received probation, and this often counted also for women engaged in casual prostitution. Statistics from the 1960s reveal two trends. For one thing, that casual prostitution was on the rise, and secondly, that the group of women who were on trial for prostitution time and again and receiving ever higher prison sentences was constantly growing. All this can be traced in police and in court sources. There's rare evidence of prostitution in government documents. A public debate on the topic developed only in the second half of the 1960s. And this is where the experts played a decisive role. So here are my experts. The group of experts who started to research prostitution in the early 1960s, or since beginning with the early 1960s, was small and interdisciplinary. In the years between 1962-3 and 1975, 5 projects on the topic were realized. The authors were physicians, psychologists and sexologists, criminologists and sociologists. Despite these disciplinary differences, there was a lot of common ground among them. All of them had come to the topic of prostitution through their everyday practice and wanted to contribute in one or another way to developing a different approach to prostitution. All the projects were realized on the basis of studies conducted in the dermatological clinic of Prague Charles University Hospital in Apolinarska Street, often referred to simply as the Apolinarska. The head of the department for venerology, Dr. Kvičera, played a decisive role to make this research happen. As a specialist in sexually transmitted diseases, he was highly interested in the topic. He granted the scientists access to the venerological ward and gave them the possibility to conduct their research, to conduct interviews with women who were held in the station after being picked up by the police on suspicion of prostitution. In their work, again, the team proceeded quite similarly. Their research with a group from 50 to 100 women consisted of guideline-based interviews, questionnaires, and a test of intelligence. In the following, I want to take a closer look at one of the studies, and I picked out the one that was done at the Institute for Sexology at Prague Charles University. This institute, whose founding history was closely connected with the dermatological clinic, was a fascinating microcosm. Unfortunately, there are many things we don't know about this institute, beginning with the question whether an existing archive has been destroyed, or whether this institute actually never happened and had an archive, or an existing archive had been destroyed or disappeared in another way, But what is definitely clear is that this institute was not an isolated workplace, but the leading institute of Czechoslovak sexology and an active player in international sexology. Josefine, the director for long decades, succeeded in securing its existence even in difficult times, like in the early 50s, mainly by expanding research on fertility. And next to this research, research on sexual deviations constituted the most important field of work of this institution. The study on prostitutes was carried out by Iva Šípová and Karel Nedoma. Although Šípová was a member of the Institute for many years and the author of countless scientific and also popular texts, I could not find information on her education and career. Nedoma, a physician, joined the Institute after the Second World War to become a specialist in sexology. He was involved in many projects, amongst others on homosexuality. Šípová and Nedoma conducted their work in the Apolinarska between the end of 1963 and fall 1964, and published their results only years later, beginning with an article in Časopis lékařů českých, the Journal of Czech Physicians, in 1970, followed by several short contributions on individual aspects in their research that appeared in different academic journals until 1974. In guided interviews, Šípová and Nedoma requested basic information on the life, education, working experience and family background of 100 women in the ward. This first part was followed by two tests that were popular at the time, a test to measuring abstract thinking and a personality test. Both tests were very simple. The scientists came to the conclusion that women in prostitution were significantly less intelligent than the average. They attributed to them a lack of discipline and endurance, poor self-assessment, and alarming emotional deficits. Among others, a lack or even the absence of the ability to bond, of building lasting relationships. This is what they identified as the reason for the disposition for casual and commercial sex. It is not too bold to say that the summary of the study amounted to a portrayal of the opposite of the socialist woman. Instead of the faithful wife and mother, we see a promiscuous woman who cannot maintain a stable relationship, not even with her children. Instead of working, she earns her money illegally. As to politics and society, she has a passive or even negative attitude. I don't want to go into detail here, and neither do I want to polemize the test procedure. To be fair, it must be said that the authors themselves addressed certain problems of their research. What I'm interested in, also with regard to our conference here, is the national and international background or context of this research. As to international research, the authors were drawing on several Western European studies from the 1950s for questions of definition and interpretation of prostitution. And then they mainly refer to a study on prostitution in Hamburg, written by Brigitte Reng and Reinhard Rethard, published in 1968. They compare the results of the Prague study with those from Hamburg, with the interesting thing being that the difference in political systems seemed practically irrelevant. Instead, Šípová and Nedoma emphasized the similarity of the results from both cities with regard to the weak intellectual and psychological constitution of prostitutes. The discussion on the causes of prostitution in the sexologist's work can be, I think, best understood from the context of the contemporary Czech debate on deviance in general. One argument here is the deprivation, a keyword from the pedagogical debate of the 1960s. Together with deficits acquired within childhood, the family of origin is an important matter. The description of dysfunctional families prostitutes come from corresponds closely to what we know from research on youth, intensively discussed in the late 1960s, starting with divorced parents or single mothers and ending with a poverty of interest manifested in the ability to spend leisure time meaningful. In short, it can be concluded that the sexological study on prostitution explained the phenomenon in the first place with biology. Second, it took a strong focus on family environment as a source of deviance, which was characteristic of the time. In my view, the meaning of what those scientists did is twofold or ambivalent. On the one side, with collecting data of women suspected for prostitution, they disclosed a world that was not supposed to exist under socialism. And in doing so, they questioned the official image, like also the idea that everybody had the same chance in society. Or on the other side, with their work, they contributed to the construction of the anti-socialist self and the construction of asocial groups in a new way that were to become important during normalization. So here I finish. Yeah, okay. So with expert discourses like the one I'm presenting here, I find it extremely difficult to get from text to practice. And here I'm not talking about the impact of scientific writing on public debates or on what people were thinking, but about how the specialists involved acted in their work with their patients, or here with their object of study. Therefore, I was very excited to come across reports on delinquent women. The Prague sexologists, Šípová, Nedoma, and Jiří Melan, another well-known sexologist in Prague, wrote by order of Prague district courts. These cases involved women who had engaged in prostitution. Experts in court were nothing new in Czechoslovakia, but the amount of legal proceedings with expert assistance increased during the 1960s, and then especially after a corresponding law had been passed in 1967. The expert's task was to evaluate criminal responsibility of a defendant against the background of their own disciplines. This is for sexologists, whether a sexual disorder prevented a person from working properly and paved her way into prostitution. One short example to give you an impression of court cases with experts involved. In 1968, a woman was on trial for prostitution and robbing clients. The reason she gave for her behavior was that she hated men after having been raped at the age of 17. Sexually, she said she was attracted to women and she needed money to make them presents to win their favor. The psychiatric expert, Dr. Purkhatová from Bohyně Psychiatric Hospital, could not find a sexual motivation in the defendant's criminal behavior and concluded that her ability to understand the harm she had done to society was neither affected by mental disorders nor by the heavy drinking problem of the woman. She attested her, I quote, a polymorphic psychopathy, homosexuality, and a polymorphic narcomania, and wrote that the woman would need therapy and social assistance to reintegrate after her release from prison. Nedoma and Melan from the Institute of Sexology, on the other side, perceived the case different. In their expertise, they spoke of a reduced control in the sexual sphere. As early as in her extremely difficult childhood, the defendant had relieved tension through obsessive masturbation. For Nedoma and Melan, the deeds of the accused woman had a sexual motive, albeit indirectly, because she had become criminal in order to satisfy her sexual desire with women. They argued that it was the deviant sexual structure of the defendant and her traumatizing childhood that had caused the unhealthy habit of buying affection and sex. In his judgment, the court referred to both expert opinions. Since the woman was a repeat offender, It imposed 1.5 years of imprisonment. This cannot be called a lenient sentence, rather it was in line with usual criminal practices. However, jail was to be followed by therapy, as all 3 experts has recommended. Let me conclude with some preliminary theses. I've shown the experts in 2 different roles. First, in their main role as researchers producing knowledge. In the 1960s, their research have been nothing special by international standards, rather solid mainstream. But within the Czechoslovak political context, it was indeed groundbreaking. By exploring the so far denied or ignored group of prostitutes, the scientists challenged the official image of socialist society. The public debate on prostitution, for which scientists played a key role, quickly came to an end in 1969. But what had also vanished at the time was the idea that state socialism would solve the problem of prostitution. During normalization, the question was no longer until when marginalized groups would be integrated into majority society, but how to deal with them in the long run. Against the backdrop of the image of prostitutes the sexologists had depicted in their study, they appear surprisingly sensitive in their second role. As to now, I don't have enough sources for far-reaching conclusions. Still, I can see that with experts in court, a different view on the defendant was present, a view on individual life stories and handicaps, be it a sexual abuse, growing up at a children's home, or coming from a Roma family. Not every case of prostitution, of parasitism, was the same. There were individual differences, and trained scientists could identify and explain them. The material I'm currently working with is raising tons of questions. To mention just 2 of them, the expertization of jurisdiction should definitely be examined in more closely, because for one thing, many judges opposed experts in court. For the other, lay jurisdiction, this is the idea that every good socialist is qualified to do justice, was maintained even after 1969. And of course, the issue of practices goes far behind the courtroom. What happened when judges prescribed therapy instead of punishment? Did social assistance for women, for prostitutes who were released from prison exist? And if so, how did it look? And last but not least, with respect to research, the career of the discourse on prostitutes initiated by scientists was typical for Czechoslovakia's 1960s. It developed between criticism of the state's practice of increasing problems by tabooing or by silencing them, and the offer of advice on how to solve these problems. How did this setting change after 1969? Who could do research on prostitution, and where were the limits of this research? So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Our next speaker is Kate Davison of University of Melbourne. Kate Davison works on the history of sexuality, of its relation to psychiatry as an expert science, but also the political condition of the Cold War. What she will present here today is a paper on the homosexual aversion therapy, but not really, you know, in a specific point, but in a transnational historical perspective. So we're very curious about that. Kate, the floor is yours.
Thanks to the organisers for putting this on. As I was thinking about the paper, I decided that I would do something far more focused on shaping the socialist people to an article that I had published in History of the Human Sciences, which Sarah obviously already knows about, for some of the transnational things. I thought, you know, that's already available in text. So my paper today is actually going to be called I Can't See Myself, but I Can See My Feet, Multi-Directional Projections of the Gendered Self in the 1950s Czechoslovakian Clinic. And I'm very thankful to Christiane and Sarah in particular for their papers this morning, because they have done a lot of the background work for me, actually. So I'm just going to jump right in. Or actually, before I do that, the reason why, just to go back to this, the reason why I was going to present on this is because I came to present through an Australian psychiatrist who was an unorthodoxly orthodox Pavlovian, and I can explain that a little bit later, who oriented his own practice on the going on in Prague, and in particular the work of Kurt Freund. In September 1962, Kurt Freund published this book, which you see there on the slide. It presented the findings of 12 years of clinical research and psychiatrists at the medical faculty of Charles University in Prague. And this research was carried out within a psychophysiological framework inspired by, as already pointed out, not in an orthodox way, by the work of Ivan Pavlov. So the research commenced in 1950, and findings were published progressively in a series of papers between 1953 and 1961 in Czech, German, Russian, Spanish, and English. The original Czechoslovakian monograph in September 1962 was followed by a German edition in the GDR in January 1963 and again in 1965. So this research, which I refer to as, became the largest, most sustained and methodologically cutting-edge clinical study of homosexuality conducted in early post-war Europe. This paper explores two different ways a new socialist self was being created within the one clinical setting, or I should say a new self. We can discuss whether or not it was a new socialist self. Within the one clinical setting, I mean by multi-directional. So on the one hand, you have medical professionals and sexologists trying to make sense of and transform individuals to fit a new self. And on the other hand, you had patients trying to either do the same or revealing stories about their own private endeavours to do so. These two very different goals had a lot in common, yet they were taking place in parallel dimensions that actually had very little to do with one another. So when we think about these questions, I'm thinking about what kinds of questions these psychiatrists and psychologists might have been dealing with at the time. Can a new self be imposed externally by psychiatrists, for example, or is it something that must come from within through individual agency? How does exercising agency fit with the project of shaping a socialist self? Can there be a collective self shaped by a collective agency and therefore a collective sexual identity? And is the creation of a socialist self a holistic process involving body, mind, emotions, and behaviours, or can these things be compartmentalised? So the clinic at the Prague Institute of Sexology was a first port of call for women and men seeking help for a range of sexual problems, ranging from anorgasmia to impotence, and same-sex desire represented only a minuscule proportion of the complaints. So what I'm going to present is really, I mean, compared to what Christiane is dealing with, really just a tiny sliver of the patient cohort, if you like. So in their published papers, the researchers repeatedly emphasised that a vast majority of homosexuals would never seek assistance of a doctor, being satisfied with their sexual feelings. Such people were, quote, not different from heterosexual people and would differ even less were it not for the moral and legal pressure of society. Women were less interested in general in treatment for homosexuality than men, possibly because female same-sex behaviours attracted less social and legal condemnation. But for 90% of the women who did seek help, the patient's wish was always, and this is a quote, to remake herself so that she could live with the woman she loved and possibly even with children. For many, this meant adopting, and these are the observations of in particular, Josef Hunier, This meant adopting masculine gender characteristics. And Hunier observed in 1950 that some of his patients, quote, had a liking for masculine contemplation and considerable dispositions of it. Some were transvestites, not only with regard to the desire to walk in men's clothes, but for life. At least 2 of his patients had undergone a mastectomy and adopted male names. So today we might recognise some of these patients as having a transgender identity, although that wasn't really how it was talked about at the time. In a 1951 article, Karl Nedemar, who Christiane talked about, emphasised how patients' self-diagnostic statements of homosexual desire were prone to inaccuracies. In their mental distress, patients would concoct psychological or physical symptoms. Men would, quote, often endeavour to see some signs of femininity on their body, for example, female hips. Often they complain of an undeveloped small penis which gradually shrinks, or a fine and not masculine body construction. But he said that the majority of cases at the Prague clinic exhibited, quote, perfect masculinity with practically no signs of female secondary characteristics at all. So I'm going to return to this sense of bodily alienation a little bit later. Using the statistical calculations extrapolated from the research findings of Alfred Kinsey in the United States, Nedemar speculated that there must be, quote, at least 10,000 homosexuals in the waiting rooms of doctors within Prague alone. Contrary to the image of a shady, suspicious traitor, Nedemar's patients lived in loneliness, frightened of their neighbours finding out and betraying them. He considered their feelings of shame, desire, aversion, anxiety, grief, and depression to be consequences of social oppression. That was his term, social oppression. So many patients came seeking, quote, an assurance that homosexuality is a natural inherent state and not changeable. But others did come seeking change and wanted help doing so. Like practitioners of other treatments prior to 1950, such as psychoanalysis or hormone treatment, these sexologists and psychiatrists still subscribed to the idea that homosexual desire was a matter of therapeutic concern, and where existing therapies had failed, perhaps incorporating some Pavlovian conditioning might prove more promising. It's here that we can see the dual reshaping of new socialist selves in a singular procedural setting. So as I said, on the one hand, a team of scientific experts thinking about ways that they could reshape their patients, and on the other hand, individual patients seeking help and advice on how they could reshape themselves. So between 1950 and 1957, Freund and his team saw more than 270 individual patients. The final data set for the monograph included 222 men, all of whom scored highly, that's it, a 5 or a 6 on the Kinsey scale. So out of these 222, 67 were treated experimentally with aversion therapy. So the first report on the aversion therapy experiment was published in 1953 in this paper on the question of male homosexuality, which reported the results from the first cohort of 32 patients. So the slide on the left is the article, and the slide on the right is actually from a much later article in 1957, but it gives you a sense of the way that the aversion therapy apparatus was set up. 7 of these 32 patients had previously undergone other treatments, including hormonal therapy, hypnosis, insulin, electric shock, and psychotherapy, all unsuccessfully. The 1953 paper included an appendix of 21 detailed case histories, and this is where the following information comes from. So this is the kinds of data that was reported in the appendix. Only a small proportion of patients in the Prague experiment sought treatment in connection with legal proceedings. One 22-year-old worker was referred after being arrested, but rather than facing court, he was sent to the clinic for further advice, which echoes some of the material that Christiane was presenting. A more common denominator was feelings of unhappiness, anxiety, social inferiority, loneliness, and depression. 17 out of these 21 patients reported having had suicidal thoughts. Sometimes such feelings of malaise were explicitly named, while in other cases they can be deduced. One office worker in his mid-20s said that he was often in a sad mood. A farmer in his late 20s reported poor sleep and irritability. A 24-year-old craftsperson had experienced dull, depressive states, palpitations, and occasional tremors. One worker, aged 41, sought treatment not for homosexuality, but due to feelings of pressure it created at work. And this patient, interestingly, reported having wished to be a woman since the age of 15. So that's the red box highlighted at the top there. And then described a mysterious seizure at the age of 23, which resulted in broken furniture around the home and a month-long stay in a psychiatric clinic. This patient was one of 9 out of the 21, that's almost half, who expressed feelings about gender that we today would probably understand as being part of a transgender identity. For 6 of them, this extended to dressing up in women's clothing from time to time, sometimes even from a very young age. So, for example, one patient who, quote, regretted not being a girl had been doing so since the age of 8. A 38-year-old waiter had done so since the age of 10, and a 31-year-old office worker had done so since the age of 12, which this patient reported had enabled them to feel, quote, something akin to excitement. On the other hand, one worker at the age of 20 had never dressed in women's clothes despite reporting having wished to be a girl as early as preschool. And another, a 25-year-old office worker, patient AV, who had likewise not yet tried it in practice, said that while imagining wearing high heels, I can't see myself, but I can see my feet in my shoes, and described this as a pleasant feeling. At other times, however, this patient was struck with anxiety manifesting in shakes all over my body. So I think here we have a very interesting dual process of disembodiment and fantasized embodiment, which is why I've kind of very cheekily put the Cinderella picture there. So rather like Cinderella, the patient's feet are only part of the patient's imagined new self when they are perfectly fitted within the right shoe. And one could extrapolate from that to the right society. But this projection of the self is not complete. It needs filling out for the full self to be created. At the same time, the psychiatrist's projected image of this patient went in quite the other direction. So the goal was to make the patient fit society, not the patient's own self-image. Almost always, however, it was not atypical desire or gender that was the motivating factor for seeking expert medical help, but these feelings of malaise, social isolation, and the stress caused by having to conceal it. One 25-year-old teacher said that what most worried him was being forced to lie. And another 40-year-old office worker sought treatment because of a disciplinary investigation at work. So the social pressure on this person to shape a new fit for work self must have been extraordinary. Were these patients lying to themselves, their workmates, their family, or their society? Seeking treatment and telling all may have been part of their self-reinvention. And this social pressure was especially acute for patients who had wives and girlfriends, or were perhaps bisexual, or had attempted to adapt to heterosexuality by engaging in sexual encounters they did not enjoy. One applied scientist at the age of 28 reported that his first attempt at heterosexual sex at the age of 19 did not excite him. Rather, it was part of his effort to conceal his homosexuality. He had only felt physically right with women on 2 occasions, yet he often thought of suicide for fear of being alone. So he doesn't want to be alone, but he also doesn't enjoy sex with women. Some patients sought intimate encounters with women out of curiosity, they reported, while others reported only doing so when drunk. Some were motivated by a partner's eagerness to marry, while others reported having entered into marriages to satisfy parental wishes or social demands. So this desire to preserve important social and family relationships is a recurring theme in the Prague cases, but it can also be found in diverse national contexts, and it's certainly something that repeatedly comes up in the material that I've looked at in the Australian and the British context. So as this small sample suggests, the empirical data collection was extensive. All of these patients were required to fill out a 350 question self-examination form. They were physically and neurologically examined, and throughout the program they were required to keep a diary. They were interviewed daily in groups and twice a week individually about the effects of the treatment. And further data was also collected from family members. And in fact, one of the female members of the staff interviewed wives and girlfriends, which was reported on in a paper in Vienna in 1958. So between 1957 and 1962, on the basis of all of this data, the Prague investigators published more than 26 articles, 8 of them outside Czechoslovakia, in numerous journals across 6 countries in both the Eastern Bloc and in the West. These articles critically addressed a range of topics arising from the research data on the relationship between gender and sexual orientation in homosexual and bisexual men, including femininity, marriage, age preferences, the seduction of minors theory, the responsibilities of parents, and the role of chromosomes. It is possible to detect differences in emphasis that reflect the ideological priorities of journal editors. So one East German journal, for example, so you can see it on the very right-hand side of the screen, published an exhaustive review by Freud of etiological theories, that's the origins of sexual orientation, which, in line with the journal's editorial stance, unequivocally supported a biological explanation of sexual orientation and dismissed psychoanalytic theories very, very explicitly. However, I know for a fact that Freud himself drew no hard conclusions on this point. His main priority was supporting work that was methodologically sound, using criteria that could be empirically confirmed, irrespective of theoretical allegiances. A recurring observation in the Prague publications was that the suffering of the homosexual stemmed not from homosexuality, but from its social consequences, penal sanctions, being part of a stigmatized minority, and what Magnus Hirschfeld had much earlier identified as a feeling of isolation or loneliness. And I should note that Josef Hunier had several times in the 1920s traveled to Berlin to train with Magnus Hirschfeld, and very much there's a lineage that you can trace from Kurt Freund back through Hunier to Hirschfeld, to this tradition of very liberal. Another recurring observation was that if psychotherapy could be shown to have any effect at all on erotic preference, which in any case remained unproven, at best it was the still exclusively homosexual patient simply learning to make do with heterosexual intercourse, which often meant staying in or seeking marriage. Hardly a positive social outcome, no matter how understanding their wives or girlfriends were. So some of the key findings, and I'm going to finish up with this. Returning to the first published study in 1953, these researchers identified 4 distinct parts of sexual, romantic, and erotic attraction, and these were personality, physical attributes, intercourse, and companionship. And for each patient, these criteria were marked according to intensity: weak, medium, or strong. By compiling such detailed data and by differentiating the elements of attraction, Freud and his colleagues sought to differentiate types of homosexual desire and perhaps even to divine a diversity of motivations and causes beyond diagnosis. And every time I read this, I just am astonished. This analytical framework reveals a level of sophistication rarely seen in contemporary literature. And even today, it surpasses a lot of the sophistication that we even see in research. So perhaps the most thought-provoking conceptual innovation was the observation of the dissociability of sexual experience. And this related to immediate sexual reactivity and the extent to which spontaneous desires were tied to particular situations, characteristics, or sexual objects. Even an exclusively homosexual phenomenon either, yet it appeared with greater regularity among patients in whom therapy had affected the homosexual desire, where desire was something akin to romantic interest, that is, a connection beyond sexual. And this complex and fascinating observation on the part of Freud and his team demonstrates how sexological research into minority or non-normative offer more universal lessons. And it also shows that far from merely trying to use aversion therapy to make these patients fit society, these researchers were genuinely interested in whether a fit was even possible and for what purposes. Their tasks as psychiatrists and psychologists would differ depending on the diagnosis and how these diagnoses would fit or not with broader socialist goals. So Freud and his colleagues shared the view school that sexual habits, orientation and psychosexual structure were not rigid. They shared the Kinsey view that it was dimensional and that it could move and shift and change depending on circumstance. They believed it would allow some patients to have heterosexual desire or eliminate the appeal of the same sex for at least some time. Yet they made an important, in contrast to neurotics, who experienced abnormal behaviour as distressing. For most homosexuals, their abnormality, so-called, was might it therefore be possible to condition patients' sexual behaviour in a heterosexual direction, irrespective of whether their inner emotional and erotic orientation actually changed? On the other hand, if, for example, increasing the birth rate was an economic priority in a newly post-war economy, homosexuality was just fine, provided that these patients fulfilled reproductive duties in a companionate marriage, meanwhile fulfilling erotic and romantic needs elsewhere. And was their clinic able to help achieve this? So that's where I want to end, but I just want to say that the outcome of a lot of this research was that, Freud and his co-workers initiated actually the change to the law that was then enacted. And I'm not trying to sort of present this as a sort of triumphal, the world end happily ever after kind of narrative, but I do think it's very, very important that this period pre-normalization was one of, as we learned from Sarah this morning, one of very eclectic mixtures of different theories. I think that these researchers were working with old models but trying to find something new, and so they were using and they had actually quite a lot of leeway in what they were doing. So I'll finish there, and yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Kate. This was an interesting material. I expected it to be much more, transnational, and I'm very happy about how focused it was. It was exactly another example of how expert science tries to describe social reality, to offer some language, to offer some analytical apparatus, and I would say that Jakub Střelec will actually bring the question even further.
So again, thank you for the presentations before. When I was listening to them, I kind of realized that I will build up on the argument that has been made, especially by Christiane Brenner, but also by Kate Davison. And I will look at a specific problem of psychiatry or forensic psychiatry in Czechoslovakia, which was the issue of psychopaths. I came to this issue while I was reading textbooks of forensic psychiatry, and I figured out that in the 60s, the key word became psychopaths, and everywhere it popped up on me in psychiatric assessments, in psychiatric textbooks, in article studies. And I decided in this presentation exactly examine this part of my PhD project. So at the beginning of the 20th century, Czechoslovakian forensic psychiatry did not pay that much attention towards psychopaths. The cause of insane crime was rather seen in different types of psychosis, especially in schizophrenia, but also depression or melancholy. After the communist coup and the propagation of Pavlovian medicine, during Stalinism, the perception of insane crime did not change much, and it was still rooted in biological models of mental health inherited from the first Czechoslovakian Republic and from a German-speaking discourse, which was very influential in Czechoslovakia in the first half of the 20th century. However, in the 1960s, the situation had changed. Psychiatrists began to use new categories such as a dysfunctional family, personality, or social environment to describe the roots of insane crimes. New keyword in forensic psychiatry, psychopathy, as it was a main topic of the discussion and also a common diagnosis in psychiatric assessments. Furthermore, after several violent crimes committed by psychopaths at the end of the 60s, which were covered by media, the issue of psychopathy also received a public attention. Following this development, the main aim of this presentation is to examine exactly this rise of psychopathy in forensic psychiatric knowledge, criminal law and criminology in the 60s in Czechoslovakia, and ask the following question. How was the concept of psychopathic criminal behavior constructed in forensic psychiatric knowledge? What kind of ideas and practices did forensic psychiatrists develop to manage the issue of psychopaths? And to what extent did forensic psychiatry influence the ways how the communist state approached crime in post-Stalinist Czechoslovakia? I will argue that this shift in perception from psychosis to psychopathy as the main root of insane crime was related to broader changes of crime in communist Czechoslovakia. It marked a new approach towards criminality, from stressing the class struggle theories and fight against bourgeois enemies to the new criminalization of different kind of social deviant or socially parasitic, as it was said, behaviors. I think that here the scientific arguments offered by psychiatrists could serve as a good way how to explain the rising numbers of crimes committed by offenders who already grew up in socialism. In 1965, the third criminalistic conference took place in Prague. Delegations from the socialist countries, Soviet Union, and all around Europe were among the main guests. In opening speech, Josef Kuderna, Czechoslovakian interior minister, claimed that, and now I quote, "The main task of forensic experts is to analyze the conditions and the roots of crime committed by those who were already born in the new social society." And he continued, "From this point of view, we consider criminal recidivism to be one of the profoundly serious problems that is certainly of interest to all socialist countries." Kuderna hence stressed that the major issue to the socialist criminal justice system are recidivists. On the other hand, psychiatrists at this conference pointed out that to understand the issue of recidivism, it is needed to study the role of psychopaths in modern society. Or as it expressed Czechoslovakian psychiatrist Jan Duba in his paper, "Only some psychopaths are recidivists. However, all recidivists are psychopaths." So the issue of psychopathy and recidivism became of utmost interest among psychiatrists, the state, and other experts in the 1960s in Czechoslovakia. In psychiatric knowledge, psychopathy was defined in relation to the concept of personality. Personality was seen as a unit constructed from different layers and structures. Hence, psychiatrists define psychopathy as a disharmony of personality, as an imbalance of biological and social aspects of human mind. Psychiatrists also distinguish several types of psychopathies, from paranoid psychopaths to aggressive psychopaths, manic psychopaths, hysterical psychopaths, chronic complainers, or sex offenders. Apart of these biological preconditions and social environment, psychiatrists also stressed that the rise of psychopathy was connected to broader changes in socialist society. On the one hand, they were arguing that socialist society was advancing towards new technologies, romanization was ongoing. On the other hand, there were growing numbers of dysfunctional families in which conflict and abuse occurred. Furthermore, psychiatrists and other criminologists and other experts discussed especially two issues related to psychopathy and recidivism: how to predict and prevent recidivism, and how to effectively treat criminal psychopaths. To answer these questions, forensic experts conducted several research studies. One of the biggest one, for example, was conducted by the head of the Czechoslovakian police, which decided to do extensive research on recidivism and its causes. A sample up to 1,000 recidivists was studied to understand the roots of recidivism in the socialist society. The survey focused on several criteria such as age, education, profession, family background, or other aspects of the recidivism. Together, 300 policemen, 40 psychiatrists, and tens of support staff were part of this research. Especially, the emphasis was put on the family background of the recidivists. For example, it was examined how fathers raised their children and what kind of educational methods they used. In another research, this time conducted by psychiatrists, it was studied around 255 cases of criminal psychopaths. And based on mathematical models, statistical analysis, first computer technologies, the authors studied 30 different factors at the accused persons. And as we can see on this slide, they concluded that there were 4 factors typical for criminal psychopaths. First, alcoholism, then a dysfunctional family, position within the family hierarchy, and childhood in orphanage. Exactly, in my opinion, in these studies, which were based on psychological tests, interviews, and statistics, the picture of criminal psychopaths was constructed and got more clear shapes. And the key outcome of this research, psychopathy and recidivism were perceived as the two sides of the same coin, both caused by dysfunctional family background or disordered behavior patterns. What is important to say, or what I have to stress, is that psychiatrists did not engage with psychopathy only on this theoretical level, but they were also very active at trials in combating psychopaths. From the perspective of forensic psychiatrists, there were some criminal offenses which were more important. Especially, psychiatrists were interested in property crimes, violent crimes, sexual assaults, or social parasitism, as these crimes were often connected to psychopaths. However, it was unclear whether psychopaths should be assessed as insane criminals and not accountable for their crimes, or if they should be treated as ordinary criminals and sentenced to prison. For example, in the first Czech textbook from the 1930s, it was recommended not to consider psychopaths as insane because it would lead to the increase of their criminality. And the similar argumentation, as we can see on this slide, was also brought in the 1960s. Here we can see an excerpt from book Introduction to Forensic Psychiatry for Lawyers from 1969, where the authors are arguing that psychopathy was a state of personality, a kind of condition of personality, and not a disease. From this point of view, psychopathy should not be perceived as an insane crime, and psychopaths should be treated in prisons and not in mental health hospitals. The main attention in this discussion about how to approach psychopaths was given to sex offenders, as they were the major challenge to the expert knowledge. There was a disagreement among sexologists, psychologists, and psychiatrists how sex offenders should be treated and approached by the penal system. This was especially manifested at one trial from 1966, which took place in Prague, when a sex offender and recidivist, Jaroslav Papež, who was already commanded to protective treatment 2 times for sexual abuse, raped and murdered a just 11-year-old boy in cinema in Prague. After a sexual assault, he stabbed him several times with scissors and hid his body. It was a very difficult case to deal with. As I already mentioned, Papež underwent 2 times protective treatment before, and in both cases, he was released as a recovered patient. Furthermore, the court needed experts could figure out the motivation, the prime motivation of his criminal act or violent act. On one hand, sexologists and psychologists were arguing that Papež suffered from mental disease at the time of the criminal act. Psychiatrists argued exactly the opposite way. Additionally, Prague Criminal Court argued that the accused person, Papež, killed the boy because he wanted to get rid of any witnesses of a sexual assault. The primary motivation of this crime would then be a fear from being exposed and not his sexual deviation. The Supreme Court refused this argumentation and requested 3rd psychiatric examination. By the way, this examination was done by Kurt Freund, about whom Kate talked. And this 3rd assessment should somehow resolve the disagreement how to approach Papež. And at the end, the psychiatrists and sexologists at this 3rd assessment, they argued that Papež, and I'll quote, was a psychopathic individual with schizophrenic personal traits and with severe sexual deviation. And according to psychiatrists, this sexual deviation was a manifestation of a personality deviation, which was lasting since childhood. So they concluded, similar like in the textbook written by the forensic experts, that psychopathy is not a disease in a true sense of word, and that psychopaths should not be assessed as insane criminals. Following this argumentation, Papež was then sentenced to death. Why I'm mentioning this case is not just because of this disagreement among experts, but it's also its media coverage. As it took place in a more liberal era at the end of 1960s, newspapers, journals published several articles covering this trial. For example, Rudé Právo, a national newspaper, informed that this, and I quote, savage act provoked outrage throughout the whole state, and that the protection of society requires to impose the death penalty. So the newspaper, often using very expressive language, were referring to the Papež as a beast who was a fan of junk fiction and horror stories, and who enjoyed torturing animals as a child. And these were the main motives of his criminal act. So they depict him as a bully, a beast, and kind of a savage. Interesting enough is that based on these articles in the newspaper, the public began to write to police letters demanding death penalty for Papež and expressing general disillusion with the trial. So this case shows us how it was difficult for actors, criminals, experts, psychiatrists, or court to approach the issue of criminal psychopaths. Lawyers and judges emphasized that Papež was afraid of revelation. Experts pointed out his sexual deviation, and public relied on the picture of the Papež in the newspaper. So overall, the case of Jaroslav Papež marked the beginning of a longer discussion among experts and state agencies about how to approach and treat sexual offenders. And that was exactly, now getting to the third part of my presentation, that was exactly the biggest discussion among experts, how to find a suitable punishment for psychopaths and recidivists as Jaroslav Papež. Psychiatrists pointed out that it's not possible to treat psychopaths in prisons, as they often become troublemakers in prison collectives. The second opinion, to treat psychopaths in mental hospitals, also did not occur as the best solution, because even here, psychopaths often disturb with patients and disturb with medical staff and the treatment there. So according to forensic experts, the main goal of the socialized penal system should mean to re-educate and re-socialize psychopaths and recidivists. Psychology or psychiatry should be used as a tool of effective transformation of psychopathic mind and body into an exemplary social citizen who would follow the rules of the social society. In order to do so, forensic experts attempted to develop different strategies based on interviewing, testing, intelligence, and so on. The highlight of this treatment should have been establishment of a special unit for psychopaths. Here I pointed out a quotation from a book about psychopathy written by Ivan Horvaj. And he's arguing that there should be established a special medical educational units within the psychiatric hospitals where psychopaths will be treated. Here he was arguing with the example of Denmark and other countries where similar institutions were already established. What is important to point out is that these plans stayed only on paper, and they were actually never put into practice as far as I know. I think it had something to do with the general system of psychiatric care in Czechoslovakia, which was based on institutional care in large mental hospitals. Lastly, psychiatrists, by this discussion about psychopaths and sex offenders, also influenced the general way how insane crime was perceived. As already mentioned, during Stalinism, criminologists explained the roots of insane crime based on either biological models of mental health or class struggle theory. Czechoslovakian criminologists argued that the Czechoslovakia, after the communist coup, occurred in so-called transition period from capitalism to socialism. And in this transition period, it was associated with an increase of crime committed by the members of old bourgeois class or people who just had capitalist habits and traditions. So therefore, experts divided between old generation of criminals and new generation of criminals. But the real challenge for the socialist state was, however, how to explain the rising numbers of crimes among young offenders who grew up already in socialism. Here, the theory of class struggle theory was no longer enough. Therefore, psychiatry and other disciplines were helpful, as they could offer a new explanation of crime based on psychopathy. So they begin to use a new language brought from psychology or sociology in describing the roots of insane crime. The key word or the key category of psychiatrists in the 1960s was this kind of microenvironment. They were arguing that in order to understand the roots of insane crime, we have to study the microenvironment of psychopaths, meaning their social relations, position within family, position at workplace, relations to the closest friends, and so on. So unlike describing the psychopathy in terms of psychosis or brain disease, in 60s, this new language is starting to occur. And categories such as social environment or personality start to be frequently used in explanation of the roots of crimes. To conclude, the rise of psychopathy and forensic psychiatric knowledge and criminal law was, in my opinion, related to broader changes of criminal justice system in Czechoslovakia. In general, I identify these three explanations of this rise of psychopathy in the forensic psychiatric knowledge. First, as I pointed out, 20 years after the communist coup, it was no longer possible to explain the crime based on class struggle theory. And in a search for a new explanation of causes of crime, psychiatrists and others offered a new theory stressing the role of psychopathy and recidivists. However, as I pointed out, these theories did not emerge without any disagreement. As we could see on the example of Jaroslav Papež and other criminal psychopaths, it was not clear how psychopaths should be even approached by the criminal justice system or by the penal system. Second, this development in crime perception was influenced by a general change of the socialist criminal law in the 1960s, which already pointed out Christiane Brenner in her presentation. The communist state focused on fight against antisocial parasitic elements, violent criminals, or individuals violating the socialist order. The main aim of the socialist criminal justice system was to re-educate criminals into properly working citizens. And this aspect of education people so they could comply with the socialist order was a new playground for psychiatrists, psychologists, and other experts. Here too, the category of psychopathy represented a useful tool as it offered a broad definition of pathological behavior which could be medicalized. And the third argument, which is more like, let's say, broad argument, which is putting the presentation into the current discussion, is the growing influence of forensic psychiatry in crime policies was connected to the general role of science in socialist societies in the 1960s. As scientific knowledge was perceived as one of the main tools towards progress towards communism, the rise of psychopathy was also an outcome of this scientification of socialist criminal justice system. As the very last, I would like to maybe propose a discussion question. Is it possible that this change in crime perception from class struggle theory to psychopathy and recidivism, which was based on the theories of psychiatrists and other experts, led to an increase of criminalization and repression in everyday life of people in the 1960s, which would go against this usual picture of the 1960s in Czechoslovakia as a liberal era? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for all these three papers, which describe certain groups of experts, moving on this edge of a sword between actually helping and supporting the persons concerned, or dumping them and sending them to jail. This is really fascinating. Now we have more than 30 minutes for discussion. I wonder if we first collect a few questions. I can't see any yet. Okay, Frank Henschel there, and then after your question, I would offer the floor to the two four speakers of Jakub to maybe react to his question he asked at the end of his paper. Frank Henschel.
Welcome, and I'm so happy to see you and to listen to those presentations. I have tons of questions, as you can imagine. Perhaps for Christiane, you distinguished between early utopian socialism and then the scientification, expertization in the 1960s and the adaptation in the normalization regime. I'm just wondering, is there such a strict differentiation, or and would you say that there was no real expertise, no real science knowledge during the studying this period, the 1950s or so, that it was all like ideology? Or how would you relate science and ideology in this decade? And to all of you, since I'm heavily dealing with childhood, and you all touched the issue of childhood in your cases, I would really perhaps ask for some precision. Which role did childhood play in the explanations of abnormality? So was it just always the family and the social environment, or also the child as a person, as an individual, somehow responsible for the later development, or how was that dealt with? And that's all for now.
Great, thank you. So because we have enough time, I would now ask for answers both to Frank's question and maybe to the discussion question by Jakub.
Thank you for the question. As you may have noticed from the list of that catalogue of questions that I put the slide up of, the kinds of questions that they were, or the kinds of data that these researchers were gathering was eclectically informed, but also kind of careful not to sort of engage or promote pseudo-Freudianism, if you like, but also they were very interested in processes of socialization and also internal kind of responses of children to their environment. So, I mean, they really didn't know how to explain how different sexual orientations emerged, but when they, you know, to sort of cover all bases, they would ask a question of, when did you first think you might be attracted this way? Did you, one of the questions was explicitly about how did you, your father, you know, what was your family situation like? Did you play, did you do housework, or did you play sport? That kind of thing. So these were all, you know, sort of statistical sort of information that they gathered. But I wanted to also comment on another aspect of childhood that came up in their research. So one of the most popular theories to explain homosexuality at the time, Slovakia, but actually probably primarily in Germany, I would say, was the Verführungstheorie, so the seduction theory, the seduction of minors theory, which, as we know, is still existing today. And one of the things that they showed is that actually this is probably not true. So they were able to empirically demonstrate that by gathering all of this kind of social, based on what they observed about patients in the clinic and matching that to what patients were saying about their own lives. So I did put in that quote from Niedermer, where he said, you know, patients would come in and tell a trickle-down pseudo-Freudianism, pseudo-psychoanalysis, where they would come in looking for explanations about themselves and say, oh, it must be because I with my father or mother. And in actual fact, upon questioning, it turns out that they don't actually have a bad relationship with their father or mother, but they've just sort of grasped a way of explaining themselves because they read about it in a newspaper article or something. Also, the other thing that they were able to establish was that on the question of pedophilia, this was a major feature of the outcome of the research. They were able to empirically attraction to people under the so when they were testing people's attraction and erotic stimulation, they had categorized pictures that were divided into age groups, and they were able to show that actually representation of pedophilic orientation amongst homosexuals compared with heterosexuals. And in fact, it wasn't something that was connected to sexual orientation. So of the sexual object or the erotic object was not connected to the gender orientation of the sexual drive. And this is something that they clearly established in the research. So there's some of the in the work that I've been looking at.
I just wanted to give a simple framework for what I was going to talk about. For sure, I'm not a specialist in science in general on the 1950s, but as to regard on research on prostitution, we can clearly say that the first new research work that appeared was a dissertation written in the early 1960s by Božena Rudlova. This work came out was never published, but you can read it in Prague libraries. And I think she defended this dissertation. She was a doctor in 1964. There was indeed a discussion on prostitution immediately after the war and in the first years after the communist takeover, but this was closely connected to questions first of law, of the legal, of how to proceed in law with prostitution, and on diseases. So with the work of Rudlova in the early 60s, something really new started. This is research in a huge group at the border of society, at the margin of society, and with collecting data on this group. We can also see a shift to the individual, to the individual life stories of those people, and also, yes, for sure, on the childhood those people had. So I would say the early 60s are a moment when something with a new quality starts, with a new scientific quality starts, and with a new perspective on a certain group of society, but also on the growing up and the socialization of those people. So perhaps that answers your question.
That was a question by Sarah Marks for everybody, she said.
Yeah, it's an annoying question, I'm afraid, to the panel, to any of the panel members who might want to respond. I'm a bit of a latecomer to the movement in the history of the PSY disciplines towards thinking about the lived experience of the patient and service user. And I think this has come up sort of implicitly in some of the responses and in some of the papers, but I wondered if any or all of you would be willing to say something about whether you have found sources that give insight into the patient or service user experience, and if not, whether you can see their agency or voice at all, and you may not be able to, in the clinical and scientific material that you've been looking at.
If I may, I will add one more question, which also concerns the sources. It is probably more for Christiane, because she mentioned this, experts literature here. She mentioned the court cases, but she did not talk about daily press, which I understood she made a relatively time-consuming and large research of. Would you tell us what it says about prostitution? That's a separate question. I don't know if what would Jakub want to react first now? Jakub, can you?
I would maybe just in general add something about archival sources and materials, and maybe the issue to get some archival sources regarding our topics, especially in Czechoslovakia. I don't know how others has the experience, but for example, the patient files are very well guarded or in psychiatric hospitals. So they are not, in most cases, they are not in the National Archive, but they are still in psychiatric hospitals. And you have to contact the hospitals and then hope that you will get the access to it. So my lens is especially, my archival sources are especially either published textbooks and articles or archival sources of criminal justice system, so courts. So I'm looking at it through these lenses of it's a lens through lenses of criminal justice system. So I don't look actually at the experience of the patients, which I would like to, but I think it's difficult to get to it. So that's, I would say, one of the major issues in our research. I was lucky to get some insight to a quite nice archival source of one psychiatrist who was working all his life as a forensic psychiatric, and before he finished his work, he wanted to get rid of all the papers, and I kind of managed to get the contact on him, and then I kind of had a whole shelf of old assessments which I could study, but it was again this unofficial way, and I'm even not allowed to actually publish something from it. So I get at least the glimpse of it, but so it's really a bit a detective work actually.
Okay, you showed us a historian can be a helping profession, actually, if it's about helping, away from loads of papers. Kate, would you like to take the floor?
Say about this, I'm going to really try and keep it brief. Thank you so much for the question. Okay, so just quickly on the Prague experiment, which is the phrase that I'm using, there are some first-person accounts. So, for example, Franz Schindler did some oral history interviews and also found a source of oral history interviews, some of whom were patients in Freud's experiment. There's also a document that actually was discovered by a friend from the Radio Free Europe archives, which documents, so it's a patient who came across to Munich for a visit and was interviewed and reported quite an interesting situation just on the question of Pavlov, a very interesting situation about the treatment clinic. So these men would stay together in one room, and there was one of them reported that there was this big picture of Pavlov on the wall, sort of like looking down on everybody, but that this patient had the feeling that Freud had it up there to kind of maintain appearances, and also talked about how Freud's position as a Holocaust survivor and a Jew and someone who was not a member of the party put him in a kind of a vulnerable situation compared to some of the nurses in the clinic who were higher up in the party, and therefore in terms of their positionality in relation to the kind of the sort of government policy, if you like. So that's kind of two sort of interesting sort of directions. But on the question of getting at patient voices in general, in my PhD thesis, I developed a new methodology specifically to address this question, which draws on the work of Anjali Arandekar, who is a historian of colonial South Asia, and Monique Shear, a historian of emotions. So Monique Shear adopts a practice-based approach to the history of emotions. You look, rather than looking for references to love and hate and whatever, you look for descriptions of behavior. So it's based on Bourdieu. And then Anjali Arandekar has an idea about using the colonial archive to try and get at subaltern voices. And together with Anne-Laura Stoller, she reads with the grain in order to read against it, if you like. So I've tried to sort of integrate these two approaches to try and use psychiatric literature to read through the published psychiatric literature for when they quote patients. I mean, who knows whether the patient actually said that? There's no way of us knowing that. But we can extrapolate from descriptions of the patient's behavior as to what the patient experience and the service user might have been. So I kind of go into that in quite a lot of detail in my thesis, and hopefully it will be published at some point. But yeah, it's something that I'm definitely developing.
Yeah, thank you very much for those questions. I first want to try the one, Sarah's question. This is a very important one I'm struggling with. The question how we can get the agency, the interest, the perspectives of the women involved into the picture. So I'm for sure, I hope that I can conduct interviews on my own, what is difficult at the moment. But I think even with the material from the courts, and I've seen like 300 court files up to now, and I think even the court situation is a very special one. There are still possibilities to read the files in a way that you get a sense of the person who stands in front of the judge. So I try to get information on the persons involved by close reading of those documents. What is really a problem is that we don't know anything about therapy in the venerological ward in Prague. If you compare the situation to literature on the GDR, then we have several books on the topic, research on treatment in venerological hospitals. And now a new book of Steffi Brüning, who really gives insight into the everyday life of prostitutions, but also on how the police was working and how treatment in hospitals was working, and also on situations in prisons and stuff like that. And so far for Czechoslovakia, there is next to no literature on it. So there's still a lot of research to be done, and when the situation is not so easy, because, as I mentioned in my paper, we don't know, or we don't have the archive of the Sexological Institute to work with, and it's really hard to get patient files in other archives. So I have some from Olomouc, but that's hard to find. Then to Adéla's question, yes, press played an important role, especially in the years between 66 and 69, where there was a huge debate on prostitution in the Czechoslovak, or especially in the Czech press. And I've analyzed several newspapers and journals. And there we can see that several scientists played an important role, like Osmančík, who was a criminologist, and he was fighting for a prostitution law. So he gave his very interesting work was never published, because he lost his position in as early as in 1969. But he had a lot of interviews in the press and also on radio. So he with his opinions, was really present in public at the time. Also to represent representatives of the so-called Population Commission, who were interested in a better control of prostitution. They also wrote a lot of text for the press. But what we have to see when reading the press is that journals, or even the radio, were not only a space where scientists were talking about their agenda, but what was kind of connected with a discussion on prostitution was also a more general discussion on the crisis of society. Like how is it possible that we are living in a socialist country and there is prostitution? So this discussion had different meaning, a whole spectrum of meanings, like the critique of the state, who had tabooed so many topics, and then a discussion on society in crisis, the question whether emancipation of women had caused this crisis and stuff like that. And then we see that it had something to do with a more liberal press, who was also interested in selling articles and sex sold. So there, for example, in one journal, I don't know whether it was yet Obrazek or Reporter, there was a series of articles on prostitution. This was so popular that these articles were published as a book in '69. So you see the popular, or the common debate, or on prostitution had so many different meanings. This is why I decided to leave it out in my presentation.
Thank you, Christiane. Kate Davison would like to add one more thing. Please keep it brief, if you may.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's such a huge, enormous question that it's very hard to do it justice. But just one more thing, had a lot more, there's a lot more accessible sort of patient voices in the Australian material and the British material that I've been looking at. In the Australian material in particular, I'm in a peculiarly fortunate situation of having the entire his entire, all the 16 boxes of material that were packed up when he died on loan to me by his daughter, as well as all of gay press account, first-person accounts that were published in the gay press, as well as oral history interviews that I myself have done. And I've been able to number of stories. I've seen names in McConaughey's files. I know the person, I've interviewed them. I've found an article that they gave at the time or an interview that they gave at the time. So that's quite, fortunate sort of situation to be in. So there are those perspectives as well. But with the Prague material, more delicate.
Thank you, Kate. And now we're collect last two questions. One comes from Peter Halama, and then from Martin Schulze-Wessel, which is directed to Jakub.
I have a question which is probably to all of you. So it's about the link, the connection between the psychological, psychiatric and sexological expertise and the legal system and the court's practice. So especially Jakub and Christiane, you spoke about the 60s, and you spoke about the changes in these expertise and in the consideration of crime in the 60s, but there is also change in the legal system. So especially we have the new criminal code of 1961 or 1962. And so my two questions are, is there any, because you start in the 1960s, so you spoke a lot of the 60s, Jakub and Christiane, and my question is, was there already an impact of new sexological and new psychological expertise in the elaboration of the criminal code? I especially think also about the question of homosexuality. So Jan Seidel and others showed how new sexological knowledge about homosexuality was then translated into the decriminalization of homosexuality. So was there an impact in the elaboration of the criminal code? And then in the 60s, but maybe also in the 70s and 80s, was there a real change in legal practice? So in for example, you both said that in the 60s, the focus was more on the personality, on that courts should take into account more the socialization and the social family environment of the perpetrators. But then I would like to know if you see any change. For example, was this like dysfunctional family? Did this become one of possible mitigating circumstances? So was there a real change in the legal practice, in the court's practices? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for the three very rich and interesting papers. I have a question to Jakub. You explained, or your question was somehow similar to the question of Christiane. How is it possible that this madness exists still under socialism? And you explained how this was formulated in the 1950s and in the 1960s, how the roots of madness were explained in the 1950s. there was a reformulation, brain diseases, and in the 1960s, a shift towards an explanation with micro-environment, family background, and so on. My question is, I think, well, my assumption is that in the 1950s, society must have played quite a great role. The idea of class struggle and impact of class struggle on the mental status. And in the 1960s, if the discussion is focused on family background and microenvironment, this is about society as well, I would say. In the first panel, Anna Antic hinted to the fact that in the Yugoslavian discourse, the contradictions in the socialist society were thematized. And could you find similar phenomena in the Czechoslovak discourse? I mean, in the Western discourse at that time, we have this idea of convergence of Western and Eastern society, that it is the industrial society which generates quite similar problems in the East and in the West. Of course, this is not an official socialist idea, but there's some evidence in the 1960s, 70s that the problems and the contradictions are quite similar.
We would like to hear, unfortunately, pretty short final statements by Christiane and then Jakub, please.
Okay, my first answer is pretty short because, frankly, I have to say I don't know whether the new criminal code, if there was any consultation or cooperation with sexologists when this new criminal code was written. I can follow debate on, but this again is more among legal specialists. During the 1970s and 80s, they want to reform, and they are fighting for a prostitution law. To the second part of your question, again, that's hard to say because I don't have statistics. Whether I even don't know in how many court cases specialists were involved. I said that I have worked with around 300 of those court cases until now. Now I've seen like 10 cases with experts from the Sexological Institute involved. And what is remarkable to me is how different the judges react in those situations. And I started to notice who's the judge, because as far as it concerns Prague 1, you will kind of always meeting the same judges, and I started to analyze how individual judges are reacting in these situations. But so far I don't have an overview on the 1970s and 80s on the general situation. One thing we can clearly see that a system of social work is built up, where, and this is interesting, those specialists, some of the specialists working on prostitution in the late 60s, and then lost their positions, were in the teams of building up socialist, those sociální kurátory, system of socialist support for people released from jail and for those people at the margins of society. But frankly, I cannot give you a clear answer on your question. To
the first question of Petr Halama, I'm afraid I don't bring much new. What already Christiane mentioned. in general, it's quite difficult to work with these psychiatric assessments because when you approach the file, you don't know if there is some assessment. So you have to go through a huge amount of files, and then if you are lucky, you find few of them. So, but what I would like to say is that the criminal code itself, in my case, which is the paragraph about insane criminality, which was a paragraph which was referring to the criminals who suffered from disease at the time of the act. They were not responsible for the act. So this particular paragraph did not change that much. So it was same as in the law as in the code from 50s and in the 60s. It was just a bit expanded, but it didn't change that much. So I wouldn't say that the criminal code changed much, but the practice changed. The question why the legal representatives became to kind of use these arguments of experts in the 60s and not in the 50s, that's maybe it's the question we have to still answer in our research. So, and just quickly to the question of Professor Martin Schulze-Wessel. I was wondering, again, in the 50s, I don't think that the forensic psychiatrists were that often at the courts. So I didn't find it many expertise at the trials. It kind of popped up only in the 60s. So I think that in the 50s, the issue of insane crime wasn't that much discussed. And the crime in general was discussed only in this class struggle paradigm. Or if really in rare cases, psychiatrists were asked to give an assessment, they used these biological models, which were rather typical for Central European contexts. So they were using textbooks or ideas from 30s, 20s, developed by the Czech psychiatrists, influenced by German scientific paradigm. So, and now there's the issue in the 60s, from nothing, these psychiatric assessments started to be present in the courts and at the trials. And the question is, why that's for, let's say, another discussion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to the speakers. Thanks for all your questions and also your patience.